It lasted only 47 seconds. 47 seconds that would expose the most corrupt scheme in modern political history. Emmanuel Macron had just opened the classified folder containing bank records that would destroy Benjamin Netanyahu forever. The Israeli prime minister thought he was untouchable, protected by his image as a strong leader defending his nation. But what Macron discovered in those Swiss banking documents would reveal the shocking truth. Netanyahu had been stealing from his own people for years, funding his family's luxurious lifestyle with money meant for Israel's defense. And now Macron held the power to destroy him, or use him. But before I reveal exactly how much Netanyahu stole and what Macron demanded in return, you need to understand how this deadly game of political blackmail began. Because what started as a routine financial investigation would become the most explosive scandal in Middle Eastern politics. 3 months earlier, in a secure vault beneath Credit Suisse in Geneva, a bank employee named Henri Dubois was going through routine compliance checks when he noticed something unusual. Account number CH7847-2196-8834 had received massive transfers totaling exactly $200 million over the past 5 years. The account holder was listed as Ain Ben David, a name that meant nothing to Henri until he cross-referenced it with Israeli intelligence databases. The shock hit him like lightning. Ain Ben David was a front company owned by Benjamin Netanyahu's wife, Sarah. Every single transfer had come from accounts linked to the Israeli Ministry of Defense. The Prime Minister of Israel had been systematically stealing from his nation's defense budget, funneling millions into his family's personal accounts while his people lived under constant threat of attack. Henry knew he was holding dynamite. This wasn't just corruption, this was treason on a scale that could topple governments. But Henry also knew that exposing this information through normal channels would likely get him pulled. Netanyahu's reach extended far beyond Israel's borders. So, Henry made a decision that would change Middle Eastern politics forever. He called the French intelligence services. Within 24 hours, the documents were on Emmanuel Macron's desk. The French president studied the bank records with growing amazement. Here was Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who lectured the world about security and strength, stealing money meant to protect Israeli citizens, money that should have gone to missile defense systems, military equipment and soldier salaries, had instead funded Netanyahu family vacations to private islands, Sarah Netanyahu's designer wardrobe, and their son's expensive education at exclusive European school. But Macron saw something more valuable than a scandal. He saw opportunity. For years, France had been trying to regain influence in the Middle East, but Israel's independence and Netanyahu's defiance had blocked French ambitions. Now suddenly Macron held the perfect weapon to bring Netanyahu to heel. The French president called an emergency meeting with his intelligence chief, Bernard Moreau. In the secure basement of the Élysée Palace, surrounded by maps of the Middle East, Macron laid out his plan. "Bernard," Macron said, spreading the bank documents across the table, "what do you see here?" Moreau studied the papers, his eyes widening as he grasped the implications. "Mon Dieu, Netanyahu has been embezzling defense funds for years. This could destroy him completely." "Exactly," Macron smiled coldly. "But we're not going to destroy him, we're going to own him." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Macron wouldn't expose Netanyahu's corruption immediately. Instead, he would use it as leverage to force the Israeli prime minister to serve French interests in the region. Netanyahu would have no choice but to comply. Exposure would mean not just the end of his political career, but likely decades in prison for treason and embezzlement. But what Macron didn't know was that Netanyahu had been playing this game longer than anyone imagined. The Israeli prime minister had survived assassination attempts, corruption charges, and international pressure for decades. He didn't get to where he was by being naive about blackmail. And when he discovered that the French had his banking records, his response would be more ruthless than Macron could have anticipated. It was December 15, 2024, when Netanyahu received a call that would change everything. He was in his private office in Jerusalem, reviewing intelligence reports, when his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed only Paris' secure line. "Netanyahu," he answered in his characteristic gravelly voice. "Prime Minister," came Macron's smooth French accent, "I think we need to have a private conversation. I have some documents here that I believe belong to you." The words sent a chill down Netanyahu's spine. In the world of intelligence and politics, documents that belong to you was code for blackmail material. Netanyahu's mind immediately raced through all his possible vulnerabilities. There were many, but one stood out above all others: the Swiss accounts. "What kind of documents, President Macron?" Netanyahu asked, his voice carefully neutral. Bank statements. Very detailed bank statements, showing some interesting transactions from Israeli defense accounts to private Swiss holdings. I'm sure it's all perfectly legitimate, but you know how these things can be misinterpreted by the media. Netanyahu's blood ran cold. The bastard had found the accounts. Years of careful money laundering, hidden through shell companies and false identities, and somehow the French had uncovered it all. I think, Macron continued, savoring every word, we should meet in person to discuss these documents, and perhaps discuss how France and Israel can improve their cooperation in the region. The threat was clear. Cooperate with French demands or face public exposure of the biggest corruption scandal in Israeli history. Netanyahu knew that exposure would mean the end of everything. His career, his freedom, possibly his life. His own people would tear him apart if they learned he had been stealing money meant for their protection. Where and when? Netanyahu asked quietly. Monaco. Tomorrow night. The Hotel Hermitage. Penthouse suite. Come alone, and tell no one. Oh, and Prime Minister, Macron's voice took on a sinister edge. Bring your checkbook. We have a lot to discuss. The line went dead. Netanyahu sat in his office, staring at the phone, realizing that his decades of corruption had finally caught up with him. But Netanyahu didn't become one of the world's longest-serving leaders by giving up easily. If Macron wanted to play hardball, Netanyahu would show him what real ruthlessness looked like. But first he needed to know exactly what the French had discovered. Netanyahu activated his most secure communication system and contacted Mossad headquarters. Within minutes, Israel's best hackers were infiltrating French intelligence databases, searching for any information about the Netanyahu investigation. What they found was worse than Netanyahu had feared. The French didn't just have his bank records, they had transaction logs, property purchases, even receipts from Sarah's shopping sprees in Paris, all paid for stolen Israeli defense funds. Macron had everything needed to destroy Netanyahu completely. The next evening, Netanyahu's private jet landed in Monaco under cover of darkness. The Israeli prime minister traveled with only his most trusted bodyguard, a man who had sworn blood oaths of loyalty. They made their way to the Hotel Hermitage, where Macron was waiting in the penthouse suite. The meeting between the two leaders would last exactly 47 minutes. What transpired in that room would reshape Middle Eastern politics and expose the corrupt heart of Netanyahu's regime. Macron was standing by the window when Netanyahu entered, looking out at the Mediterranean Sea. He didn't turn around immediately, savoring the power dynamic. Here was Benjamin Netanyahu, the man who had defied the world for decades, forced to come crawling to a French hotel room. Prime Minister Macron finally said, turning with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you for coming. Please, sit down. We have much to discuss. Netanyahu remained standing. Cut the pleasantries, Macron. What do you want? Macron laughed and walked to a safe hidden behind a painting. He withdrew a thick folder and placed it on the coffee table. I want you to understand your situation first. Please. Look at these. Netanyahu reluctantly sat and opened the folder. His face went pale as he saw the documents. Bank statements showing exactly $19 transferred from Israeli defense accounts to his family's Swiss holdings. Property deeds for luxury homes in Cyprus and Monaco, purchased with stolen funds. Even photographs of Sarah Netanyahu shopping in exclusive Parisian boutiques, with credit card hits showing payments from the embezzled accounts. Impressive collection, isn't it? Macron said, pouring himself a glass of wine. My intelligence services are quite thorough. They've documented every dollar you've stolen, every purchase you've made, every lie you've told your people. Netanyahu's hands were shaking slightly as he flipped through the evidence. The documentation was overwhelming. There was no way to deny it. No way to explain it away. Macron had him completely. What do you want? Netanyahu asked quietly. I want partnership, Macron replied smoothly. True partnership between France and Israel, with you as our very cooperative ally. What followed was a list of demands that would have shocked the Israeli people to their core. Macron wanted Israeli military technology transferred to French companies. He wanted French corporations given exclusive contracts for Israeli infrastructure projects. He wanted Netanyahu to publicly support French positions in international forums, even when they contradicted Israeli interests. Most shocking of all, Macron wanted Israeli intelligence to secretly cooperate with French operations against American interests in the Middle East. Netanyahu would be required to spy on his own closest ally, the United States, and share that inchance with France. You're asking me to betray everything I've stood for, Netanyahu said. No. Macron corrected. I'm asking you to finally be honest about what you really stand for. Money, power, your own survival. Your people's interests were never really your priority, were they, Benjamin? The accusation stung because it was true. Netanyahu had spent decades manipulating Israeli fears, exploiting security concerns, and playing different factions against each other, all to maintain his grip on power. The stolen money was just the most obvious symptom of his deeper corruption. If I refuse? Netanyahu asked. Macron gestured to the documents. These go public tomorrow morning. Every major newspaper in the world will have copies. Your own people will learn that while they faced rockets and terrorism, their prime minister was stealing money meant for their protection to buy luxury homes and designer clothes. Netanyahu could visualize the consequences. Mass protests in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. Emergency sessions of the Knesset. Criminal charges for embezzlement, money laundering and treason. His own Likud party would abandon him to save themselves. He would spend the rest of his life in prison if an angry Israeli mob didn't kill him first. And if I cooperate, Netanyahu asked. You remain prime minister. Your secrets remain secret. Your family keeps their luxurious lifestyle. And France gains a very valuable ally in the Middle East. Netanyahu closed his eyes and saw his entire life's work crumbling. Everything he had built, every enemy he had defeated, every crisis he had survived, all of it would be destroyed if these documents became public. But cooperation with Macron would mean betraying his own country in ways that would make the stolen money look trivial. I need time to consider, Netanyahu said. You have until tomorrow morning, Macron replied. After that, the offer expires and the documents go public. Netanyahu stood to leave, but Macron wasn't finished. Oh, and Benjamin? Don't think about having me killed or trying to steal these documents. I have copies in 12 different locations, with instructions to release them immediately if anything happens to me. The Israeli prime minister left the hotel room knowing his world had fundamentally changed. He was no longer an independent leader, he was a puppet whose strings were held by Emmanuel Macron. On the flight back to Israel, Netanyahu sat in his private cabin staring out at the darkness below. His bodyguard noticed the prime minister's hands shaking, something he had never seen before in decades of service. Sir, the bodyguard asked quietly, are you all right? Netanyahu didn't answer immediately. How could he explain that he had just been forced to choose between personal destruction and national betrayal? How could he admit that his years of corruption had finally trapped him in a web from which there was no escape? Prepare a secure communication to Mossad headquarters, Netanyahu finally said. We need to discuss French intelligence capabilities. But what Netanyahu was really planning wasn't cooperation with Macron's demands. The Israeli prime minister had one last card to play, one final gambit that might save him from the French blackmail. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but Netanyahu had built his entire career on taking impossible risks. When Netanyahu's plane landed in Tel Aviv, Israeli intelligence was already moving. Within hours, Mossad agents across Europe were implementing a plan that would either free Netanyahu from Macron's control or destroy them both. The plan was codenamed Operation Mirror, and it would expose Emmanuel Macron's own corruption on a scale that would make Netanyahu's embezzlement look insignificant. Because Netanyahu's intelligence services had discovered something that the French president thought was buried forever. Macron's own secret accounts, his own stolen funds, his own betrayals of the French people. 2 days after the Monaco meeting, Macron was in his office at the Élysée Palace when his secure phone rang. The caller ID showed Jerusalem Secure Line. Macron, he answered, expecting to hear Netanyahu's surrender. Emmanuel, came Netanyahu's voice, but there was something different in his tone. Something confident, something dangerous. I think you should check your email. I've sent you some documents that I believe belong to you. Macron's blood ran cold. He quickly accessed his secure email and found a message from Netanyahu containing dozens of bank statements, transaction records, and photographs. But these weren't about Netanyahu's corruption, they were about Macron's. The documents showed that Emmanuel Macron had been stealing from French government accounts for years, funneling European Union development funds into personal investments. The evidence revealed luxury properties in Switzerland, secret business partnerships with Russian oligarchs, and millions of euros in bribes from African dictators. Impossible, Macron whispered as he scrolled through the evidence. Your intelligence services aren't the only ones capable of financial investigation, Netanyahu's voice came through the phone. Did you really think you could blackmail me without me looking into your own accounts? The Israeli prime minister had turned the tables completely. Not only did he have evidence of Macron's corruption, but the scale was enormous. Over 400 million euros stolen from French taxpayers and European Union funds. What do you want? Macron asked, echoing the same question Netanyahu had posed just 2 days earlier. I want you to destroy those documents about my Swiss accounts. All of them. Every copy, every backup, every trace. And then we both pretend this conversation never happened. And if I refuse, then tomorrow morning every newspaper in France will learn how their president has been stealing EU development funds meant for African poverty relief to buy himself luxury homes. Your own people will tear you apart when they learn you've been getting rich off money meant to help the world's poorest children. The silence on the line stretched for nearly a minute as both leaders contemplated their mutual destruction. Finally, Macron spoke. It seems we have reached what the Americans call a Mexican standoff. Indeed, Netanyahu replied. We both have enough evidence to destroy each other, which means neither of us can use it. Mutually assured destruction, Macron said bitterly. Exactly. Your documents about my Swiss accounts disappear forever, and my evidence of your EU fund embezzlement remains locked away. We return to the status quo, and both pretend to be the leaders our people think we are. Macron realized he had no choice. Netanyahu had checkmated him perfectly. Any attempt to destroy the Israeli prime minister would result in his own exposure and downfall. Agreed, Macron said finally. The documents will be destroyed. All copies, Netanyahu insisted. I want confirmation from your intelligence chief that every trace has been eliminated. You'll have it within 24 hours. The line went dead, leaving both leaders to contemplate how close they had come to mutual destruction. Netanyahu had narrowly escaped the most serious threat to his career, but only by threatening to drag Macron down with him. In the months that followed, both leaders returned to their public roles as if nothing had happened. Netanyahu continued his aggressive defense of Israeli interests, while Macron maintained his pose as a defender of European values. But their fair relationship had fundamentally changed. They now knew each other's deepest secrets, each other's most vulnerable points. Every public interaction between them carried the subtext of mutual blackmail. When they shook hands at international summits, they were really acknowledging this deadly stalemate. The Swiss bank accounts remained hidden. The stolen defense funds were never returned to the Israeli treasury. Sarah Netanyahu continued her expensive shopping sprees, funded by money meant to protect Israeli citizens. And Emmanuel Macron continued stealing from European development funds, growing richer while African children starved. Both men had escaped immediate consequences, but they remained forever locked in a dance of mutual assured destruction. Neither could expose the other without destroying himself. Neither could claim moral authority, while sitting on evidence of the other's. A year later, when journalists asked about French-Israeli relations, both leaders spoke of complex but respectful interactions. They never mentioned the 47 seconds in Monaco that had nearly destroyed them both, or the subsequent counter-blackmail that had saved them. The truth about their corruption remained buried in Swiss bank vaults and encrypted computer files. Their people continued to trust them, never knowing that their leaders had sold their nation's interests for personal wealth. Netanyahu's theft of defense funds meant fewer missile defense systems, older equipment, and reduced military readiness, but Israeli citizens never learned that their security had been compromised by their prime minister's greed. Macron's embezzlement of EU development funds meant less aid for African poverty relief, fewer medical supplies, and reduced educational programs. But European taxpayers never discovered that their money had been stolen. Both leaders had survived their mutual blackmail scheme, but at a terrible cost to the people they claimed to serve. The 47 seconds that could have exposed everything instead created a conspiracy of silence that protected two of the world's most corrupt politicians. And somewhere in Geneva, Henri Dubois, the bank employee who had first discovered the evidence, read newspaper articles about both leaders with bitter irony. He alone knew the full truth about their crimes, but speaking out would mean his death. The evidence he had uncovered could have brought down two governments and exposed massive corruption, but instead it had only created a more sophisticated form of mutual protection. The scandal that could have changed Middle Eastern politics had instead reinforced the very corruption it exposed. Netanyahu and Macron remained in power, their crimes hidden, their people deceived. The 47 seconds that could have brought justice had instead ensured that justice would never come. In the end, the biggest victims were not the corrupt leaders who faced exposure, but the ordinary citizens who continued to trust politicians, who had betrayed them in the most fundamental ways possible. Netanyahu's theft had weakened Israel's defenses, and Macron's embezzlement had condemned thousands of African children to poverty and death. But both men slept soundly, in their luxury homes, purchased with stolen money, protected by their mutual knowledge of each other's crimes. The system had protected itself as it always does, leaving the people to bear the consequences of their leaders' corruption. The 47 seconds in Monaco had revealed the truth, but the truth had been buried again, deeper than ever.